Hi, my name's Bob Mitchell. I teach animal studies and psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. I'm here today to talk about anthropomorphism. Everybody's talking about it. It's just the topic of the moment. Anthropomorphism is attribution of human aspects to non-human entities. So, for example, if you say the front of a car looks like it's a face, and you're thinking of a human face, then it would be anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphism came to be a big deal when Darwin came up with his idea that we were in some way evolutionarily related to non-human animals. And so this became a big issue because he believed that you could look to animals and say, this animal is experiencing jealousy, this animal is experiencing happiness, this animal is experiencing dreams, thoughts, any number of things by animals' behavior. And people then started assuming that animals could believe and know and understand just about anything. And so when scientists got into the picture and decided to look into it, they started questioning whether we can use descriptive terms like jealousy, envy, happiness, thinking, to categorize what animals are doing with any degree of certainty. The consequence of that is that people became very skeptical about what we could attribute to animals. So if I said, for example, that my cat is upset, in many ways that seems very reasonable, and the judgment about their being upset isn't anthropomorphism because I'm not using human upsetment to characterize the animal. I'm not saying, oh, this is a particular type of upsetment that this animal is experiencing and this is human upsetment. I'm just saying, judging from the behavior, it looks as though the animal is experiencing some distress. So it became a problem when people were saying things like, my dog understood I was having a birthday party for him. The dog may have understood something like it was a fun event, he was or she was the center of attention, but it doesn't seem likely that the animal understood that it was its birthday party because dogs don't have the sense of birthday. So this became the issue. What can we attribute to animals? What can't we attribute to animals? And I guess I think of it as an empirical issue. I think of it as something that we can find out. So for example, when we decide to use terms, we have certain things we go on. When I'm talking about your thinking, I'm not sitting there knowing what's going on in your head, what kinds of experiences you're having. I may know the type of experiences, but I don't know the exact experiences. What I'm doing is judging from what's happening in the context you're in and the behavior that you engage in. And it seems as though that is what we need to be doing to decide whether animals are having any kinds of psychological states like perception, emotion, thinking, etc. There's a problem, of course, because in some cases animals' behaviors may be ambiguous, so it may be difficult to know what they're experiencing. But the thing is, the same thing is true of humans. And if you think of the term anthropomorphism, which comes from making into the shape of humans, that's sort of the idea there, if we are using some kind of human quality that we think is unique to humans, then anytime you use it, it's going to be anthropomorphism. But if you think of our understanding of humans as based upon what's available to us to understand, the same is true of animals. Humans can verbally describe things, and so far we've only made limited entrees into trying to understand animal communication by comparison with human communication. But we just don't know enough about what's unique to humans, and the only way we're going to find out is if we find out what animals know, understand, think, believe, experience, perceive, etc. So it makes it very complicated. And I would say if we think of anthropomorphism as an empirical question, can animals experience this, then I think it becomes much more interesting and no longer is really going to be anthropomorphism if we find that animals do have some kind of psychological characteristic trait, etc., that we had thought was perhaps unique to humans. The other part of this equation is that people talk about humans as if they're one single entity. And we know that they're not. There's so many ways of being human, and you expect there's so many ways of being a dog, and so many ways of being a gorilla, and so many ways of being a fish. And so it does seem as though we need to almost jettison the term and instead start looking at what is the psychology of animals and not concern ourselves with how similar they are to us or how unsimilar. Of course, the problem is where we get our psychological terms is largely from ourselves and from other people telling us what they're experiencing, but also our judging. I often bring up with students the idea of how do you know you're jealous? And I said, most of the time, did someone else tell you that you were jealous? And most of the students seemed to say, yes, somebody else told me I was jealous. I didn't know I was jealous. And so it does seem as though some terms aren't things that come from us thinking about what we're experiencing, but rather other people say, judging from your behavior, the context, the situation, etc., it would appear that you are jealous. So, in the upshot, I would say anthropomorphism is only problematic when you're a scientist and you are not being concerned to make sure that you have enough evidence to believe that an animal has a certain kind of experience or psychological trait or characteristic. When we define our terms so that we say this is what we're looking for, then we can end up seeing a variety of things like friendship, happiness, joy, deception, etc., that we often thought animals couldn't possibly engage in. Hope you find that interesting.